ברשותכם קהל נכבד, אני אעבור עכשיו לאנגלית על מנת להזמין את אורחת הכבוד של הכנס, פרופסור מריאן פרקש, מומחית בעלת שם עולמי בתחום השיקום ובריאות הנפש, להרצאה המרכזית של הכנס בנושא מעורבות מתמודדים בשיקום פסיכיאטרי והחלמה. And now I have the honor to invite the keynote speaker of the conference, Professor Marianne Farkas from Boston University. Professor Farkas is one of the leading experts in the world in the field of psychiatric rehabilitation. Professor Farkas is going to speak about peer involvement in psychiatric rehabilitation and recovery. Please.
I'm going to talk about the history of peer services because I think it's important to know where the movement has been as well as where it is. I'm going to talk about some research that has been done in the area of peer-delivered services, and I'm going to talk about some issues that are common and some ways that we have come up with answering those issues. I'm mostly going to talk about peer-delivered services rather than other forms of peer involvement, like policy involvement, evaluation involvement, involvement in the media, etc., because we find that the most controversial form of involvement is in services. So that's what I'm going to mainly focus on. Do you understand my English? Or? Yes. Okay. Because when I start to talk very fast, I want to thank Tamar, who makes it possible for me to speak in English. You have a hard job, Tamar. So as I tried to say before, let's start with some history. I find it interesting to note that the first recorded peer-run service was in 1539, developed by a Spanish converso. Do you know what a converso is? Yes? Yes? Nobody? Yes? Okay. No. A converso is someone in Spain who was Jewish and changed to Christian in order to hide from the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition. Given where I am, I think it's very interesting that the first recorded peer-run organization was a Spanish converso by the name of Juan Cidade, who was an ex-patient himself, and he founded an asylum in Granada. And this is the symbol of that order. The pineapple is the symbol of this organization because it was the symbol for hospitality. And the patients in this organization were called guests, and the providers were called hosts. St. John of God has 300 hospitals around the world. 175 of them are psychiatric institutions today. But it started in 1539. Kind of interesting, huh? In 1620, there was a pamphlet in England called The Petition of the Poor Distracted People in Bedlam, which was a big asylum in England. It was written by people with psychiatric experiences who were patients in the hospital trying to improve their conditions. In 1845, there was a group of 4 people who got together and formed what they called the Alleged Lunatics Friend Society. Isn't that interesting? 1845. And the Alleged Lunatics Friends Society was the prototype for today's movement in the United States. Richard Paternoster was his name, was hospitalized, released, and when he was released, he put an advertisement in the newspaper for fellow sufferers to join him in addressing abuses of the hospital. 4 people joined him. One of them, I think his name was John Percival, was the son of the Prime Minister. The aims of this group was to reduce the likelihood of illegal incarceration. That is, being put into the hospital illegally, to improve conditions in the hospital, to support discharged patients, and to enlarge the views of the public about mental illnesses. What I find so interesting was that this was 1845, and the aims of the movement were not that different than what they are today. There were other examples of individuals who made a great impact on the delivery of, bless you, on the delivery of mental health services. For example, Dorothea Dix, who went on a crusade to take people out of poor houses, where people went when they had debt, poor houses, to create hospitals as a reform. And that crusade in the 1860s was fueled by her own experiences of psychosis, as well as her sense of social justice. Dorothea Dix was a peer. Clifford Beers founded Mental Health America, which is an advocacy organization even today, and the mental hygiene movement in 1910, which came from his experiences of hospitalization. Recovery from addiction, was catalyzed by Bill W. Bill W. Developed Alcoholics Anonymous. Alcoholics Anonymous, which was the largest peer organization of people who suffer from addictions. And in the early 20th century, this man, Harry Stack Sullivan, a psychiatrist who became very famous for his theories about dealing with psychosis, who famously said that people with psychoses are much more fundamentally human than otherwise. And he talked about mental illness not as mental illness, but as problems in living. It turns out he suffered from psychosis himself, and he made a practice of hiring recovered and recovering patients to be staff. Harry Stack Sullivan is a very famous psychiatrist. More recently, in the 1960s and 70s, spontaneous groups formed in Oregon, California, New York, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Kansas in the context of the civil rights movement and the empowerment movements of minorities of different kinds. So in the 1960s and 70s, the consumer movement was just a liberation movement like all of the others, like the women's movement, Black Power movement, etc. The goals of the movement at that time was liberation from the mental health system, developing people's own self-help programs, refusing to believe in a mental illness, and overcoming the prediction that recovery is impossible. Those were the goals of the movement in the 1960s and 70s, and groups sprang up, just like that, all with different names, reflecting the feeling of the time. There was the Insane Liberation Front in Portland, Oregon, the Liberation Project in New York City, the Network Against Psychiatric Assault in San Francisco, and the Mental Patients Liberation Front in Boston, Massachusetts, which is where I come from. So it's important to note that for us in my country, the consumer movement sprang up spontaneously in a culture of civil rights. But the goals of the movement were not that much different than the goals of the alleged Lunatics Friends Society of 1840 in England, which was to stop the abuses in psychiatric institutions, to change public attitudes, and to provide support to people who were suffering from similar illnesses. In the United States, specific individuals were critical to moving the movement forward. Without them, there would be eruptions of energy and enthusiasm, but no direction for those eruptions. Some of the individuals who were important in moving from the 60s to the 70s to the 80s were people like Judy Chamberlain, who wrote a book in 1978 called On Our Own, Patient-Controlled Alternatives to the Mental Health System. That book became a manifesto for many groups. Also in other countries, there are chapters of On Our Own in many countries around the world. She is considered by some to be the mother of the modern consumer survivor movement. Another person who was very important was Howie the Harp. Howie the Harp said things like, "Crazy folk are the most talented people in the galaxy. Instead of diagnosing, locking up, and treating us, the world should recognize our true worth and support our talents, creativity, and sensitivity." Howie the Harp's real name was Howard Geld, and he's credited with being a pioneer in the development of advocacy for people with psychiatric disabilities. He himself was homeless for many years, and he picked up a harmonica to earn money, and that's how he got his name, Howie the Harp. He said that he enjoyed this name because it made him similar to a lot of others with the same middle name, Howie the Harp, like Ivan the Terrible and Winnie the Pooh. He was the person who began the Mental Patient Liberation Project in New York City, Project Release, and the first peer specialist training program. Today, advocacy centers are named after Howie the Harp. So after this period in which there was a lot of turmoil in the United States, and it was a lot about the civil rights movement, the consumer survivor movement entered the mental health arena. It began outside the mental health arena and really was more concerned with support with issues of social justice and decreasing abuses. And the first form of progress, if you'd like, was through legislation. There was a lot of advocacy that came from the fact that deinstitutionalization was not enough. We had deinstitutionalized many people. Between 1972 and 1982, 56% of those within psychiatric hospitals were out in a 10-year period of time. And it became clear that deinstitutionalization was not enough. So there was a lot of pressure to change the system. And the influence of the consumer survivor movement was on changing legislation. For example, the enactment of the Community Support Program in 1977, which requires the involvement of consumers and families in planning services. In 1986, Congress passed the Protection and Advocacy Act to deal with discrimination. This is like an ombudsman service. So then we went through a period of progress through legislation to progress through getting organized. The first conference on human rights against psychiatric oppression was in 1973, and its focus was on support, consciousness raising, discovering identity, supporting a sense of pride. It began with a collaboration of radical practitioners and academics, and over time the radical professionals and academics were excluded from this movement, and it became a movement only for peers by the 1980s. Alternatives, which was the next conference that was sort of became the national focus of attention, was funded by the federal government. And that changed the nature of the relationship between the government and all of these various groups that I've been talking about. So alternatives began as a how-to meeting. It's a national conference. It still happens every year. All consumer groups come together. 200, 300 different consumer organizations come together, usually in Washington, for a conference the same as you would for the American Psychological Association conference. And it's a how-to meeting, how to organize self-help groups, how to raise funds, how to work with the media. It's that kind of a meeting. It included mental health professionals, and it provided opportunities for survivors of psychiatric institutions to meet those who call themselves ex-patients and those who call themselves consumers. And each of those groups have very different worldviews. We have a lot of problems with words in the US. What to call people, what people want to call themselves. So we have some people who insist on the term survivors, meaning survivors of the abuse of the institution. We have some people who call themselves ex-patients because they are no longer patients, they used to be patients. We have some people who call themselves consumers to reflect having some sort of power of the marketplace over services. And then we have people who talk about people with lived experience of mental illness. And this is not something that professionals call people in recovery. It is the bubbling up of various points of view within the consumer movement itself. So alternatives became a place where people from all of those points of view could get together and hash out their differences and similarities. So progress through legislation, then progress through organization, and progress through collaboration. As I told you, whereas it was specific to community support programs, by 1989 the federal law mandated that state-level planning, you know we have 50 states, state-level planning had to include stakeholders in the development of any new programs and any new services. That was by law. CSP, which is that community support program that I talked about before, funded, that's a federal program, funded demonstration projects in collaboration with mental health staff. This was a period of collaboration. For example, the federal government funded 13 demonstration drop-in centers run by peers. You don't have drop-in centers. These are self-help places, usually a room with a lot of activities in it where people literally drop in and drop out. There's no schedule, there's no requirement. It's like a social arena where people can come to socialize, engage in activities, get support and information, or not, depending on what they want to do. So they funded demonstration drop-in centers. The National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors published a position paper confirming the importance of involvement in 1989, and there's an Office of Consumer Affairs in every state. The 1980s then was this period of transition, and this man, Joe Rogers, who's a peer, is very well known because he ran the first consumer-run technical assistance center. That's a national center that provides technical assistance and consultation to both peer-run organizations and to mental health services who are trying to integrate peers. Reaching Across the Arts, a self-help arts guide, was published in the year 2000 with funds from the federal government, with information that's still relevant today about how to use the arts to bridge the gap between individuals with psychiatric disabilities and the larger public. People like Patricia Deegan, who I know has been to Israel, became the director of an organization called Common Ground that was dedicated to finding something that could be the beginning of a collaboration with mental health professionals, finding a way to have common ground between individuals with psychiatric disabilities and people who were professionals in the mental health services system. So the 2000s and forward were a time where we took the collaboration to the next level and started to develop special projects and partnerships. For example, certification for peer specialists. At this point in time, and actually I'm on this task force, we are trying to come up with standards together, consumer organizations, people who are academicians, trainers, to certify peer specialists in their own discipline. Wellness coaches, the development of wellness coaching, the development of different domains of recovery, peers in many different venues, alternatives to crisis programs, arts programs. So it's a period that has been very fruitful. We started separate, in opposition. We developed legislation, organizations, an infrastructure, and now we are trying to work together in many instances to solve basic problems. This is an example I like to give because the Wellness Recovery Action Plan is an intervention that was developed by peers outside the mental health system. Academics at a university did the research, randomized clinical trials on this particular intervention, and now it's part of the regular mental health service as well as any peer-run services. Wellness Recovery Action Planning is a way of helping people to use techniques that have been used by many other peers in a systematic and organized way to get through crises and treatment barriers. So it's an example of what I'm saying is that in the 2000s, we are taking interventions outside the mental health system, taking interventions inside the mental health system, moving outside, and finding the barrier between mental health system and non-mental health system to be fluid. Developed the International Association of Peer Specialists in 2004, which is an association of different peer specialist training programs who, like any professional association, like ISPRO, like the Psychological Association, get together to further the aims of that discipline. People like Dan Fisher, who is a psychiatrist and is also a person in recovery, is the executive director of the National Empowerment Center. He sits on the President's Commission for Mental Health, as well as developing something called eCPR, which is emotional CPR, and an intervention designed to make the general public as willing to provide immediate help to people in emotional distress as they are to someone who's having a heart attack. Last example I want to give you is that of Paolo Del Vecchio. Paolo Del Vecchio is a person in recovery who now runs the federal mental health system. So he is in the position that Yahil was in. I guess, Ronit, that you are Yahil. To drink some. Paolo Del Vecchio is now the director of the federal mental health system. He is a social worker with lived experience. So this was a very fast run through history from 1500 to 2000. I hope I didn't bore you because it's a United States history, but I think it's important to see how peer support has been with us for centuries, whether it was recognized or not. And whether it was recognized or not, people in recovery have always gotten together to support each other. And at some periods in time, the external culture has been more helpful and supportive in helping to create groups and helping organizations to spring up from the ground up. And in other times, in other cultures, that has not been quite so friendly. So we are now in the United States at a point where we are on a delicate balance between helping to standardize interventions, helping to standardize the skill sets that peers should have in order to get paid by the national insurance companies, et cetera, all of these sort of functional things, and making sure that we are not distorting or co-opting the influence of peers. You know, there's always that kind of balance between people who are outside the system, who have influence and are able to change the system, and then bringing people inside the system, and if you're not careful, before very long, they look just like the system. That's just human nature. So we're at that balancing point now. And especially because the federal director is a person in recovery, we are very conscious about this. So this history provides the context for the remarks I'm going to make today. You didn't know that I hadn't started the remarks for today yet. Okay. So I want to talk about peer-delivered services. Are peer-delivered services unique, or is it commonplace? Oh, I see that this doesn't allow me to do my little thing. All right. My animation disappeared. Mutual support, self-help, peer support, consumer-run programs have really grown over the last 30 years. There was a survey that went out to count them, and we found 7,476 programs. But that was in the year 2006. We haven't done that survey again, and we should. These programs describe themselves as mutual support groups. Are they very different one from the other? Perhaps, perhaps not, but these are the way people identify themselves. Mutual support groups, where people help each other, served about 45,000 folks. Self-help groups, where there was a process that people used to help themselves, served over 1 million people. And consumer-operated programs, that is, programs run by consumers, served over 500,000. In the US, peer-delivered services are reimbursable. That's very important in our system because we have a private for-profit system together with a public not-profit system. So if peer-delivered services were not able to be reimbursed by insurance, if insurance companies wouldn't pay for them, they wouldn't exist because they couldn't get funding. So now in 27 states, peer-delivered services are able to be funded. In the UK, the state-funded services before 2010 did not have any peers in them. And now it's part of their trust system. Trust is like a community mental health center. So the answer to the question, is it unique? No. It's on its way to becoming commonplace. Why should there be peers in psychiatric rehabilitation and other recovery-oriented programs? Because of the basic values of recovery and psychiatric rehabilitation, which is that people should be involved in designing, delivering, and evaluating services. That's a value of recovery. People should be involved in designing, delivering, and evaluating services, and it's a critical component of a recovery-oriented service culture like psychiatric rehabilitation. So, promoting the hiring of individuals with serious mental illnesses as peer providers, as well as in the role of helping professionals and administrators, reflects this culture of full partnership. That's why we do it. Possibly the most powerful act to shift towards a recovery orientation is to create valued roles for people in recovery, both peer support workers and professionals with lived experience. This is a quote that I like from the federal government's Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services. When people do not see recovery as part of their lives, they need to be surrounded with the possibilities of recovery. And that's what peer professionals and peer support workers provide. It's categorized by the aim of the program and the locus of control, who controls the program. So when the There are peer services where the aim of the program is to provide services. Shirut. That's another word I learned. Although I learned it as the shuttle from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Anyway, so, I don't mean that sort of shirut. Service provision. So there are peer-operated services. The locus of control is peers. Peers run that service. And there are non-peer operated services where peers are the employees. But the aim is service provision. There is mutual support, back and forth, peer run, which are called self-help groups, non-peer run, which have to do with peer partnerships and initiatives. So what are peer-operated services? Can I tell you a little bit about those? In 2006, there were 1,100 peer-operated services in the US. That is, they were funded both publicly and privately. They were managed and directed by people in recovery, which is the word that we use these days, people in recovery. The majority of the governing board of these organizations are people in recovery. It's even operationalized. It must be a minimum of 51% of the board in order to be called peer operated. Examples of these kinds of services are drop-in centers, housing programs, employment programs, education programs, programs in financial literacy, and hospital diversion programs. I'll tell you more about these later on. Self-help programs, there were 3,300 mutual self-help mental health groups in 2006. They are increasingly part of the system. We'll talk about peers as employees. Let's see. Peers as employees have a common, this is a common title for peer designated services. Peer specialists, peer counselors, peer advocates, recovery specialists. These are all different terms for what we mean when we say peers as employees. These employees in these roles focus on increasing hope for recovery by helping people to identify and capitalize on their strengths, promoting wellness, self-management, skills, and engagement in services. Professionals with lived experience, on the other hand, are people like Paolo Del Vecchio, who have a master's degree in social work, or they are psychologists, or they are psychiatrists, who also have lived experience. And they add that lived experience to their discipline-specific work. They may or may not disclose their situation. So professionals with lived experience are people who have disciplines credentials, like social work, psychologist, OT, blah, blah, blah. And they have the added benefit of having lived experience, which they use in their work but may choose or not choose to disclose. To be a peer employee, a peer counselor, a peer support worker, you by nature disclose your situation because that's the job title you have. And that role focuses on specifically increasing hope for recovery, helping people identify and capitalize on their strengths, promoting wellness and self-management skills. That's peers as employees. Peer partnerships, peer initiatives. I'm showing it here, which you can see. This one. These are efforts in which the mental health service is in partnership with peer organizations. So they may share space in a mental health service. That's one way of having a partnership. There's no place for the group to meet. The mental health service provides a space. And or mutually enhanced services. So for example, running self-help services inside a mental health center is a peer initiative. It's not peer run, but it's a peer service that enhances the delivery of the services of the mental health agency. When peers act as aides, escorts, provide outreach services, or ombudsman for existing services, we call that a peer partnership. Partnership between something that peers do and something that the mental health service can use and expand in terms of its ability to deliver services. So what do we know about these things? A peer-run hospital diversion program, increased social involvement, life satisfaction, and experienced stigma. This is an outcome study. This peer-run hospital diversion program works with people in the community at the point when they start to, they're at the beginning of developing symptoms and crisis. That's what we mean by hospital diversion. Instead of having to wait until someone is down the road and go into hospital, this peer organization developed a method for helping people to go through their crises without having to go into the hospital. And the research showed that they were able to increase social involvement, life satisfaction, and they had less stigma, of course. Another example is a program that's called Peer Link, where they trained peer coaches to provide transition help and linkages to services and natural supports in the community to people leaving inpatient treatment. Okay, so they trained coaches to provide transition help for people who were coming out of hospital and trying to get back on their feet in the community, and they helped people link to services as well as natural supports. And this program decreased the number of days in hospital. Another program that added peer providers. Do you have ACT programs? Assertive community treatment? No. Okay. Intensive case management, excuse me. I know you do. Where's Tamar from Inosh? I'm taking off my jacket. She teases me about how hot I get while she's wearing her coat. Boston is minus 22 today. Anyway, so intensive case management. These intensive case management programs have integrated peer providers. They've added peer providers to the case management service. And what they found was they were able to decrease the rate of hospitalization, that is the number of times people went back and forth to hospital. They developed a positive perspective on the consumer-provider relationship, and they increased retention in the program. That is, people dropped out less when they added peer providers to the case management program. Another example of a peer provider program, the group that received peer provider services increased their skills. So they added peer providers to a regular mental health program, and they, the group that received peer provider services increased their skills, increased their ability to access resources, and meet their own needs. When the program ran over 260 days, not a short-term service. All right, so we know that we involve peers because of the values of recovery and rehabilitation. We also know that it makes a difference if we involve peers. So I want to talk for a minute about what research actually shows us other than these individual programs. What you have here, and I want to give you hope, I'm not going to go through all this. Okay, this is just to tell you, should you be interested, these reviews that I've listed here are all the systematic reviews that have been done of the literature since 2011. And I think the thing that you should notice is that when they started doing a review of the literature in 2011, they looked for studies that had at least 5 people in them to study. That's where they were. The one that was just done in 2014 had an N of 5,597 subjects that they looked at. And they were only looking at randomized clinical trials. So the field has grown. What can we say with confidence based on the research we have? We can say, after all that we did a meta-analysis of all of these systematic reviews, Peer-delivered services, when added to traditional services, can be as effective as those delivered by professionals. So we have pretty good solid evidence that when peer providers deliver case management services, their outcomes are the same as case management providers who do not have peer experience. So we know that people can be as effective as professionals with clinical training. Peer support may not have advantages over and above traditional services for achieving traditional outcomes. That is, when we compared peer-delivered services and professional-delivered services, we didn't have a lot of evidence that there was a significant difference when we looked at traditional outcome measures. What are traditional outcome measures? For the most part, they have to do with reducing symptoms, decreasing hospital days, etc. But what do we know about the effectiveness? We know that peer support promotes empowerment and overall well-being. It may, when I say may, it means that the statistics say that the trend is moving in that direction, but the difference is not huge enough. May decrease the need for acute mental health services. It may increase social support functioning and activities. It may decrease substance abuse, and it may have a beneficial impact on the perceived quality of life. What are the benefits of employing peers? It creates positive role models for other staff. It increases the sensitivity of all staff, which is really important because we know from other research that of all the sectors of employers who have stigma and prejudice about mental illness, the mental health services have the highest level of stigma and discrimination. So the fact that it increases sensitivity of all staff is an important finding. It increases the adherence of the program to recovery values. It makes the program more likely to be recovery oriented. It improves knowledge of local resources, invigorates the program, encourages learning. For peer providers themselves, Marianne, who is an Israeli academic, did a study that indicated that for peer providers, being a peer provider improved psychiatric symptoms, improved physical health, a sense of self and empowerment, interpersonal relationships, work capacities, and skills. You know, the sad thing is that the version I have of this slide has all kinds of animation and everything, and it all left. So now it's just boring text. I apologize for that. All right, so we know that peer-delivered services may fill a unique niche in the array of mental health services that may complement existing services and may add it to the service array in a way that cannot be accomplished by the delivery of traditional mental health services. But we need more research to better describe the activities. A lot of peer services have no description. It's not clear enough what people are doing to be able to really study it well. The intensity of the services and supports, the role, the training, the credentials of the peer delivering service, and the context for service are things that we need to know more about and we don't know yet. So what are some of the challenges for organizations embedding peer support? One of the service challenges is to answer some of these questions. Do the peer staff view the service users as their peers? Remember I talked about the problem of bringing people into a system and then not distorting the value of what they give. And some of the indicators of that distortion have to do with a question like this. Do people who are peer staff inside the organization see the service users as their peers? When the service has started to mental healthize, distort the peer support services, peer staff stop seeing the service users as their peers. Are peer staff encouraged to disclose their own recovery stories, or are they required to disclose their own recovery stories? In programs where that distortion is starting, people require that staff disclose their recovery stories, as opposed to leaving it to the person as a choice. It's the beginning of changing the nature of peer support and treating people in a way that leads to distortion. Is there clarity in the roles, or does the peer staff role overlap with existing staff roles? In order for peer support, and I'm not talking now about professionals with lived experience, I'm talking about peer support per se, there has to be a unique, clearly defined role that isn't the role of anybody else in order for the greatest impact of the outcome to be seen. Do peer staff spend the majority of their time doing things or listening? In programs where that distortion starts to creep in, you find peer staff who are spending most of their time doing things like driving people to the doctor's office, helping people fill out forms. Not that those are bad things, but that's not the value of peer support. That's not a unique value of peer support. Anybody can drive somebody to the hospital and drive people to the doctor's office. The unique value of peer support has to do with what I said before, which is providing hope, inspiring, helping people develop skills and self-management skills. Do peer support staff have a champion in the senior leadership positions to endorse and ensure the integrity of peer support? Is there someone in senior management that understands peer support and champions the development of peer support services so that it doesn't end up just being like anything else? Are peer staff viewed as one element of a broader agency-wide transformation? In some mental health services where there is this distortion I was talking about, they have a checklist to be recovery-oriented. And on the checklist is add peer staff. And once we check that off, we're done. We go on, we do exactly what we did before, but now we have peer staff, so we're recovery-oriented. We take off our old sign, we put on our new sign, we say recovery-oriented day treatment. So in a program which is really embedding peer support, peer staff are viewed as only one element of a broader agency-wide transformation to recovery orientation. Is inevitable discrimination addressed within the workplace? Is it understood to be discrimination? You know, we had a campaign in one mental health agency that I helped of riding. I used to ride in the elevator in this service. That was all I did for hours. I rode up and down in the elevator. Why? Because when staff got on the elevator and started talking, the language that they used, the things they talked about, were very discriminatory. Yes? If I had been a person in recovery on that elevator, I would not want to disclose my lived experience. It made it unsafe, but staff were told, it's not that, I'm a clinical psychologist, it's not that I am like an evil person because I do that, but because there's a certain kind of acceptable way to talk about people. And in elevators, coffee shops, in casual places, we tend to do that. And if somebody tries to raise that issue and call it for what it is, which is discrimination, people get very irritated. And they start talking about political correctness and the thought police. But the truth is, the way you speak reveals what you really think. And so, is inevitable discrimination addressed? How is it addressed in the workplace? And I don't care whether it's discrimination against people who have lived experience, because usually those places also have other kinds of discrimination going on. Discrimination against people who are transgender, who have a different sexual orientation, who come from a different culture. Part of what I'm doing now in a 5-year project I've been working on is to help agencies increase inclusion instead of looking at decreasing discrimination. Because when you look at decreasing discrimination, you're always doing this, which is not really helpful. When you're trying to put together a program of inclusion and creating an inclusive environment, you're looking at what are the positive things we can do so that everyone feels safe in this environment. All right. Is our peer staff trained and supervised for the roles they are being asked to perform? There are some enthusiastic mental health services that I know of that hire peers because it's on that checklist I told you about. They get money if they hire peers. And then the peer can't do the job. Then everybody gets upset with the peer, and it's a big balaga. It's another word I learned this week. Over and over again. Why? Because if you don't train people for the role that they are being asked to perform, people can't do the role. It's not magic. That's another reason why you have to know what the role is so you can train people to be able to do the role. I don't care who you are, whether you're a manager, a person in recovery, whatever it is. You need training to be able to perform the role. Are people supervised by someone who understands the value of life experience? When people are supervised by others from a discipline which is not peer support, this becomes very tricky. It's like having a social worker supervised by a psychologist. You can do it, but it has to be a pretty special psychologist to be able to supervise a social worker, because I know how unique social workers are. I'm a psychologist. But at any rate, you know what I'm saying. If you have a unique service, you need to be supervised by somebody who knows that service. And at least if not, you have to have somebody who's supervise you, who's trained in what that discipline is supposed to be. Are there opportunities for upward mobility? If all you can do is be a peer support worker and there's no career path, there's no way to move, then it's a distortion of the meaning of consumer involvement. If you can only do one thing, that means that your value is not seen in the rest of the organization. And in order to be recovery-oriented, in order to really have peer support, you need to have the ability to have upward mobility. The last challenge has to do with the tension between engaging people into existing systems of services and support by encouraging attendance and adherence, which is a role that often peer support workers have, encouraging attendance and following the program, versus advocating for the system itself to change in order to become more responsive. This tension is a challenge to embedding peer support. Do you understand what I mean by that tension? On the one hand, peer support workers are often in a position where they are being asked to increase attendance at the mental health service system and to increase the capacity of people to follow the program, to do what they're supposed to do, to take the meds they're supposed to take, to follow the treatment they're supposed to follow. On the other hand, with the nature of peer support, one of its impacts is to advocate for the system itself to change in order to become more responsive to the needs of the people it serves. And being able to navigate that tension is a real challenge to embedding the service. So do I have any suggestions in the last few minutes I have? I'm going to talk about what we've learned about embedding peers as employees in organizations that are not peer-run, because that's the majority of the organizations. But many of the principles I'm talking about apply even to organizations that are peer-run. What we've learned is that increasing involvement of peers as employees requires these things: leadership, policies and procedures, training, supervision, and support. And if I had my wonderful slides, this would all show up in little animation with little music. Okay. Leadership, what do I mean by leadership? Leadership has to ensure that peer support has a chance. Leaders are the critical agents of change in an organization. They have to communicate the vision that recovery is possible. It has to come from the leadership. It can't be the job of peer support workers to make the statement that recovery is possible. It has to come from the leadership. They have to provide the inspiration. They have to model, they have to be a role model for everybody else around the skills and attitudes towards involving peer workers. They have to guide the organization through all of those tensions and difficulties in a way that keeps the recovery orientation in its form that you want rather than the distortions. They have to be the ones looking out for the distortions, the signs of distortion. The leaders have to be the steward. Do you know what a steward is? It's one of those.
The one with the chocolate.
The what?
We have an issue with chocolate.
Okay.
Sure it is.
All right, the one with the chocolate. Of the mission and values of the organization. So you have to have a leadership that really gets it, bottom line, in order for peer support to really be embedded and not just to be an add-on. The policies and procedures may have to be changed to accommodate new practices. I don't know enough about what the requirements are for mental health services here, but some of peer support happens in a very flexible, non-traditional way in non-traditional places. There has to be a way that accommodates, a policy that accommodates that. People might go over to somebody's house. That has to be okay. They might hang out in a ballpark for 3 hours. That has to be okay. So policies and procedures may need to be changed to accommodate new practices. Whoa. You just got to review. So you want to, in training, educate all the staff about recovery and peer provider services. So training has to be for everybody. Everyone has to understand what this is, how it's similar and different from what they do, and why they're doing it. They have to train all staff to meet the demands of their job responsibilities. Training can be formal or informal. There has to be a learning environment. You have to learn from each other and allow staff and peers to provide training in their areas of expertise. I don't know why it disappeared there. I'm starting to get suspicious. The word peer disappeared from here. Allow staff and peers to provide training in their area of expertise. So what does this say? It says that your organization, in order to embed peer support workers and become more recovery oriented, has to be a learning organization. You have to have a learning community and think of yourself as a learning community so that people are trained, all staff are trained to provide the specific service that they are expected to provide. I'm not going to go over this. These are some of the requirements of certification for peer support providers in North Carolina. Every state has its own, where it specifically says what kind of training, how much background, what the methodology is. People have to know how to get to where you're asking them to go. You have to differentiate between supervision and support. Supervision helps you to do your job tasks. Support helps you to deal with your feelings about the job tasks. So supervision and support are not the same thing. Okay, I did this, how do I undo it? You have to develop clear and flexible job or role descriptions. This was the thing that came up most often in most of the research that was done. In organizations where the job functions were mushy, ambiguous, peer support didn't work. And that's not just because peer support work was unclear, but all the job descriptions were unclear. People bumped into each other. Nobody knew what they were being evaluated on. No one knew what the outcome was that they were supposed to deliver. So supervision and job functioning was very, very unclear. Those organizations which had clear and specific job tasks in which the supervision identified what people were supposed to do and how they were supposed to do it usually had much more success. I already talked about investing in skilled supervisors. Accommodate and provide useful, reasonable accommodations. You have accommodations, right? You do accommodations? Yes. So reasonable accommodations for everyone is an individualized thing. For some people, it might be spending more time on records than everybody else, having more time allocated for that. For some people, it might be being able to sit in a quiet place, away from fluorescent lights and lots of noise. For some people, it might be being allowed to come into work at 10:30, that's me, because I don't do well early in the morning. And for some people, the medication just makes it hard to think early in the morning. Having staff meetings later when everyone is awake, those are the kinds of accommodations that are important. Monitoring the skills of the supervisor and also providing support in the supervisor's roles, in their roles. So doing with the supervisors what you expect them to do with the staff that they are supporting. Support means being aware and responsive to the personal challenges that all workers experience on the job from time to time. Not seeing this as a function of people because they have lived experience of mental illness, but all workers have family stuff they have to deal with. They're in crisis, things change, they get sick, they get better. That kind of responsiveness to personal challenges are very important to people in recovery, but also important to everyone. You have to define the type and intensity of support the program is able and unable to provide. The person may need support the program can't provide. That's fine, but it has to be clear. So when you come to this agency, you have to know how much support can I get? What is not allowed? What is not available? And then what am I going to do to get that support outside? Link people who need additional supports to additional resources. Agencies shouldn't be providing therapy, but there are enough people out there doing therapy that people can link to them in order to be able to perform their job task well. So what have we learned? We've learned that peer employees thrive in workplaces that are run with general best practice managerial principles, clear roles, clear expectations, clear appraisal mechanisms for everyone. It's not something different, it's just more critical. We've learned that supported education is the key to career advancement and more integration in the system of peers and non-peers. Having places for people to train, having community colleges, having universities that allow people with lived experience to finish degrees is really important to the integration. And we've learned that modern psychiatric rehabilitation cannot evolve without the presence of peer employees, peer-run services, peer-run alternatives, peer-led interventions. Why? Because without all of that, of those kinds of services, psychiatric rehabilitation becomes stale. It becomes stuck in its own traditions and methodologies. It is the dynamic interaction of all of these pieces together which keeps the service alive and effective. Final thought. I bet you thought I'd never get hurt. Growth is never by mere chance. It is the result of forces working together, peers and non-peers, family members, peers, stakeholders, legislators, funders. Working together is what creates growth. Thank you very much for your attention.